Hello everyone, welcome back to AppDev channel. As part of asynchronous communications implementation video series, in the last video we talked about implementing. We have developed the job submit API implementation, and we have called it from the postman how to invoke it, and it has accepted the request, and it is also created in SQS in the AWS. We have also seen how to connect to the AWS services using the access credentials and all, right? So as part of that, what we have to do, the next step is to create a backend system, right? The job process API we have to develop in today's video. So that should be accepting a request that should be invoked from the job submit API. Once the service is invoked from the job submit API, the job process API acknowledges the request, and it also puts the job status updates into SQS. Okay, so that's the agenda for today's video. So the job process API we are going to develop, and we will define what is the request and response structure for this API. We will also invoke this API from the job submit API, and finally we will try to send the messages to SQS. Okay, so without any further delay, let's start with developing the backend project. Okay, for that, this is our client project, right? This is in a different workspace. It's running on 8080 because I want to maintain both client and server running at the same time. So I'll give the server project or the server microservice to be running on a different port like 8090 or something, so that I can execute the client and server at the same time. So for that, I have initiated a new project. So this is the project job process server and com app dev Java 17 Maven. Okay, so that's all. Okay, now let me create a project, and let me add the web dependency initially. If at all any other dependencies are required, we will see it later on, because we have to push messages to SQS, right? We'll see how to push the messages to SQS by adding some other dependencies related to AWS SDK Java APIs. Okay, for now let me create a project. So once the project is created, we will have to expose one endpoint URL that should be invoked from the uh, client, right? So before we start, let me rename this demo com.appdev. That's it. Okay, so let's wait for it to complete. Okay, so it's done. Okay, let me create a controller, REST controller, which is a job process controller. Okay, I will also create this in a controller package. So for that, let me create a new package, controller. Okay, so let me move it here. Okay, now we have the job process controller. Let me annotate this with the let's annotate this with the REST controller, and the request mapping is the tag annotation which we have to use to specify the request URL or the path for this particular controller app slash backend. So here I have to expose a method as a REST endpoint URI process job submit request, or process job, whatever it is. Okay, here it is going to accept a post request. Okay, and that post request will be having a post mapping. I'm annotating with post mapping. So process job submit is the URI for this endpoint. So process job method, right? It is going to accept the job process request vivo. Okay, job process request vivo. Okay. So it will be coming in the request body, right? So let me give it as a request body. So that's all. Okay, this one we have to create. Let's say for example, let's put some this out that the job request is accepted, job request received. Okay, now let's create this job process request view in controller view. Okay, so what this job process request view will be having, so it is going to be having all the request data, right? So let's just annotate first with the component, and later on user ID it will be there, and the job name, and start date and end date that are being selected in the screen. Okay, and it will also be having a queue name that is created. Okay, front end is going to create this queue, right? That queue name will be coming here in the request. Okay, now let me just create the constructor from superclass, constructor from fields, and also setter getters for all of them. Select all. Okay, so the job process request view is ready. Okay, so our controller is also ready, right? But what we have to do in the controller when the job process request view is received, right? So what we have to do, we have to acknowledge this request, and we also have to uh, push the messages to the SQS, right? So for that, what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a service layer for that. So all those things I will be doing it in that service class. Okay, so com app dev service job process service. Okay, so the job process service, we will have to annotate with that component. At service I'll use it. Okay, because this is a service layer, right? Okay, now so it should be having a method, right? A public uh, what will be having, it will be having a method to process the job submit request. Process job submit. Okay, it will be accepting the job process request view that it has received from the UI or the middleware. Okay, so we are ready now. Okay, the service layer. Okay, we have to give something like string. Okay, we will return submitted from here. Okay, similarly we will return submitted from here as well. Okay, response entity of string. Okay, here what we will do, we will call that job submitted service, job process service here, job process service. Okay, so the job process service dot process submit request, job process request view. So whatever it returns, right, it returns the submitted message. Okay, status message it returns. So we have to return this one, right? Return a new response entity string. So what is there in the response entity? So if you want to send any body or a status code or a message or headers, whatever it is, right, you can send everything here. So let me just use it if I can send it here. Okay, here status message and http status dot okay, I'm going to use. Okay, so with that, our skeleton of the backend job submission job process API is ready. Yeah, it has to do one more operation, like it has to read this job process request vivo, and it has to read the queue name, and it also have to push the messages to the SQS, right? It also have to establish the connection to the SQS. All those things we have to do. But what we will do initially, we will start invoking this particular service from the client layer. But before that, what I do, I go to here and I'll mention server is equal to something else, not 8080, but I want this to be running on 8090. So let me start this now. Let's just see whether it runs on 8090 or not. Yeah, it's running on 8090. So my backend API is ready to be invoked from the front end, from the middleware, right? So here is the thing. Here, that time we created the queue, right? In the earlier video. Here we have to create job process request vivo, and then we have to send that request by invoking the backend service, right? So for that, what we do, we will create a client vivo. Okay, here in the client side, client vivo job process request vivo, I'm going to create. Okay. Otherwise, what we can do, we can copy whatever the job process request vivo we created in the controller vivo, right? We can copy the same thing to our client project in the client vivo. Okay, so instead of this one, I'm going to maintain it in the vivo pack, client vivo package. Okay, let me create a vivo package now inside client. Okay, let me move it here. Okay, so in the client vivo, we have the job process request vivo being created. So for this one, what we have to mention, we have to set the data up when before we are calling the backend. So where we are calling the backend, we have to call from here, right? So let's create a let's create the job process request vivo object. So what is the job process request vivo? Job. We are already having the job process request vivo, right? So we will have it here. Uh, we will import that here. Job process request vivo. Job process request vivo. We will auto edit. Okay, we have imported it. So we are going to create a set user ID is user one. Okay, job process request viewer dot set start date 2023 0401, set end date 0431. What else is there? We also have to send the job name, right? Job name is something like uh, job one or something. Okay, job name. And we also have to give the queue name. So what is the queue name we created? That queue name we have to send it to the backend, right? Because on which only it is going to push the status updates. So the job process request Vivo input object to call the backend API is ready now. So now let's call the what we let's call the backend API, right? So in order to call the backend API, we are going to use the REST template. Okay, we are going to call that server or the backend microservice from the middleware microservices, right? So for that, we have to use the microservice to microservice communication or something. So for in order to achieve that, we are going to use the REST template. So if we at all we have to use the REST template, right? Uh, Earlier I have created one video. I'll give that a description. I will give that link in the description. Like what are the different steps that we have to create to use to create the REST template, like HTTP client, components, request factory, and how to set up the client request timeout or the connection timeout or the socket timeout. All those things we have discussed in detail in our earlier videos. So I'll give that link in the description. Please go through that. But for now, what I'm going to do, uh, I'm going to copy this particular class REST template config. Okay, here it is having how to create the REST template. Okay, with the custom settings. Okay, so let me copy this class in my in a config package. New class REST template config, and it will be there in com.appdev.config. Okay, so if you see here, so what we are doing here, we are creating a REST template bean. Okay, that bean is we are creating from the with the customized settings from the HTTP components client HTTP request factory. So how this components HTTP request factory is being created with the properties like service.employee.list. So for this example, what we do, okay, service.backend.list, okay, or service.backend, whatever it is, okay. So in application properties file, uh, yeah, here we have to maintain those properties service.backend dot some properties will be there, right? Like the properties which we have to use for customizing the connection creation, like connection request timeout, connect timeout, read timeout, or whatever it is, right? So we can use them here. Okay, so instead of employee.list, service.backend, service.backend. So instead of creating the default HTTP client or the REST template, these properties will be injected to your components factory, and this components factory will be used to create the REST template. Okay, with the help of configuration properties, we can inject the properties into this bean, right? So, so that's all. Okay. Now our REST template is ready. So, but we have to use this REST template to call the job process API from our job process server, right? So we have to import, we have to auto-wire it here, REST template. We already have a bean that will be created and managed by the container, right? So REST template is the name for it. Auto-wire. So we have the bean REST template configuration ready. So REST template dot, we have a method here in the REST template dot exchange. So in the exchange, what we have to give, we have to give the URL and the HTTP method name and body, all those things, and the response type. Okay, so I'm going to use this one. So what is the URL I'm going to use? HTTP colon slash localhost. What is the backend service URL that I have to mention? App slash backend slash process. What is the URL we are running here for backend process? So app slash backend slash process job submit, right? Okay, after that, what we have to mention, we have to give the HTTP method. So that backend service is accepting the body, right? Request body, because it needs some parameters. So we are going to call that as post method. Okay, then what is the thing that we have to send it here? We have to give the request entity. Okay, if you see here in the exchange method, so HTTP URL we specified, HTTP method we specified, we have to specify the HTTP entity. So HTTP entity is something which we have to create here. So what is the HTTP entity? It will be used to send the request bodies. So what is the request body? The job process request to Vivo, right? Request body is this. Okay. So here we are creating the HTTP entity, right? So on what basis we are creating the job process request Vivo, we have to send it. So request body is here. So let's use the request body. So what is the response type? So the job process API is going to return whether the job is submitted or not, right? It is just a string it is returning. So response entity of string, that is the response that we will receive from the backend service. Okay. So what is there in the response? Response dot or response entity. Let's give it as response dot get body. Okay. String response message. So that's it. Okay. So what is there? Let's print it here. Response message create. Response message received from Backend to middleware. Response message I'm going to use. So with this, our front end and back end integration, middleware and the back end integration is also ready to submit the job. Okay, we are not yet ready to listen or to push the updates or to listen to the status updates. We have just completed the coding part of the job submission thing between middleware and the backend. So let me start this service as well. Okay, there is a problem here. class not found exception. So in order to resolve this class not found exception with HTTP client on client 5, right? Because we are running our project on Spring Boot 3 and it is internally we are using the HTTP components factory, right? It's internally using the Apache HTTP client 5 API. So we have to import that package to our project. Okay, like this client 5 Apache HTTP client 5 version. This is the latest version which we have to use. Okay, with that, it's going to build our project. It is going to download. Now let's start our client project now. Let's just see whether the problem is resolved. Yeah, it's able to start the server now, right? Uh, the client service, and this is the backend service. It's already running, right? So what we will do, we will trigger the middleware service, the job submit API like this with some data, okay, like appdev user one, appdev 10 or something, and this is the job name. This is the start date and end date. Okay. So what it will do, the middleware service first comes into picture. Okay. And then this is the middleware service, right? Okay, fine. And this is my backend service, right? Okay, fine. Now the moment I submit a request to this backend service, it accepts the request, creates an SQS, prepares the jobs process request, and invokes the job process request. Then job process request, this one, job process request, gets the request from the middleware, and it just acknowledges that your request is submitted. That's the thing, that's the part we have done till now, right? Later on we will try to push the job status updates to the SQS that it has received from the request, job process request. So let me just go and trigger the job submit request. So I have triggered a request now, right? So this is the client workspace. So job request is received from the job submit API to job process API, and job process API is also send a message that job is submitted from your service to my service from backend. It has received a message from backend to middleware, job is submitted. So with that, we have tested successfully the backend and middleware integration for the job submission part. Okay, now the if we look at the agenda, so we have done first 3 points, right? Now what we have to do, we have to make some changes to our project to connect to the AWS services in order to push the messages to SQS. Okay, so we will take that up in the next video because of the length of the video. I don't want to have the much more lengthy videos. Meet in the next video by sending messages to SQS from the job process API. Thank you for watching. Please give it a like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Thank you again. Bye bye.